and I'm glad to have the opportunity to address Bill 6. The government has said that this bill is an attempt to limit public drug use from occurring in public spaces. But like so many pieces of legislation from this government, what it states as its purpose publicly is very different from its actual intention and, most importantly, from the real impact that it will have on our communities. We agree that people who use drugs should not have to use drugs outdoors in unsafe public spaces, and that no one should have to sleep outside in a tent. But when we talk about reducing public drug use and unsheltered homelessness, we have to talk about how we got here and the strategies that will actually help us to achieve that goal. Over the past 7 years of this government, we have seen an escalation of the toxic drug crisis to a public health emergency, but we're not acting like it. We've seen the highest rates of encampments and unsheltered homelessness ever reported across this province. Over 80,000 people in the recent AMO report were reported as being unhoused, and we know that this is likely an undercount. The reason, and I will interrupt myself to say that I'm sharing my time with the member from Ottawa Centre. Thank you. The reason we're in this position is because our government has abdicated its responsibility to take care of people virtually across all sectors. The government has drastically underfunded healthcare services, including mental health and addiction services. This government has drastically underfunded housing and downloaded the responsibility of managing the homelessness crisis onto municipalities, who are now trying to shoulder the bill for shelters, supportive housing, social housing, and encampment outreach. All of that responsibility is now being shouldered by municipalities because the province refuses to take a leadership role in actually managing the crisis. We have seen the lowest housing starts on record, the lowest investment in supportive housing, and we are seeing more and more people unable to stay in their housing because of the erosion of tenant rights and protections. And so yes, we're seeing more people end up outdoors, having to put up tents in our communities, and that is a shame for our government to carry, not for the people who are outdoors. And now faced with the visible consequences of their poor policy decisions, rather than actually doing anything to solve the root causes of the problem, this government is now trying to blame the people who have been made most vulnerable by our system's failures. In addressing the issue of public drug use, we have to recognize that this is no one's ideal circumstance. I have had thousands of conversations with people who use drugs over the last several years, and what I can say definitively is that there is no person I have spoken to whose preference it is to have to use drugs outdoors by themselves in an unsafe circumstance. And when I asked someone just yesterday, what do you think would actually solve the problem of outdoor public drug use? What they said was, from their experience as someone who had been unhoused, as someone who had used drugs, and as someone who has now been able to live for many years in remission from their substance use, their two solutions were supervised consumption sites and housing. It's simple, and it's within our control to do. It's not safe for people using drugs individually to have to use drugs outdoors or in public spaces, because often they're in a position where they're using alone, they're trying to stay hidden, they're trying to stay out of trouble, they're trying to avoid charges, and as a result, they're using in circumstances that are riskier than they need to be. We know that this increases their risk of overdose, and also means that they're often using in less sanitary conditions that increase the risk of infections and other complications related to drug use. And so it's particularly baffling that this bill is being tabled just over a month after supervised consumption sites were shuttered across this province that were designed to address the very issue that this government says that they want to solve. Supervised consumption sites were designed as a response to the overdose crisis, to save lives and to reduce public drug use. This government's reckless legislation pushed people out of safe, indoor, highly regulated, highly protocolized spaces where trained professionals were able to help people access treatment and the essential services they needed. And now, having shuttered those spaces, the government is wringing its hands because those same people have now been pushed out into the community, and public drug use is becoming an increasing concern. Which, by the way, every expert and every harm reduction worker could have told you would happen if you closed supervised consumption sites, but you didn't even bother to ask them. And so now we're in a position where we have to implement solutions that are actually going to work to both keep people safe who are using drugs while ensuring that our community spaces can be enjoyed by everyone. This bill will not accomplish either goal. This bill is essentially a performative, tough-on-crime distraction so that the government doesn't have to take responsibility for the policy failures that have gotten us in this position in the first place. Instead of addressing this head-on by investing in supportive housing or by reopening the doors of supervised consumption sites, we are seeing our government proposing that we try to criminalize our way out of a health crisis. In this legislation, our government has proposed that we hand out $10,000 fines or offer people up to 6 months in jail if they are found to be using drugs in public. And for my members across the aisle, $10,000 might seem like just the cost of one table at a fundraising dinner. But for someone who is unhoused and suffering from severe mental health conditions, it's more money than you could imagine paying in a lifetime. So the fines essentially become meaningless. Every person I know who is unhoused has been given ticket upon ticket and fine upon fine and charge upon charge, and they're never going to be paid. They're just going to hang over people's heads and erode their dignity and distract resources from actually addressing the problem. It's ridiculous and it's performative. It's our government's attempt to say that they are doing something, while in fact they're doing absolutely nothing to solve the problem or generate any sort of real solution. And then there's a threat of up to 6 months in jail. But drug possession is already a crime, and we've been criminalizing people for drug use for years. And somehow that hasn't seemed to solve the problem of public drug use. And on that note, it's important to remember that the cost of keeping someone in jail is 7 times higher than the cost of housing them. So why are we dedicating resources and expanding the occupation of our jails instead of actually housing people? And not only that, we know that for people who use substances, incarceration is far from a benign experience. It is one of the riskiest times for people who use drugs. A study from researchers in Hamilton found that people who are incarcerated have a 30% greater likelihood of dying from a drug overdose in jail than they do in the community. And for those who manage to survive their incarceration, 1 in 10 die of an opioid overdose within 2 weeks of release. And why is that happening? Well, because many people in jail are not offered the standard of care of treatment for their substance use disorders. As much as our government may want it to be, jails are not hospitals. They are not clinics, they are not mental health services, and they are not the correct place for people with substance use disorders and mental health conditions. And as they're not offered universally opioid agonist therapy, which is a life-saving treatment for people with opioid use disorder, they are often not given any kind of continuity of health care when they leave jail. They're often released without any supports, to unsafe locations, and without any effort to try and ensure a safe and successful transition back to the community. And if someone does use drugs after jail, the loss of opioid tolerance from the time that they did spend incarcerated puts them at extreme risk of overdose and death. So make no mistake, putting people in jail will not promote treatment. It will not help people enter into recovery. We know that statistically, time in incarceration is bad for your health, it costs our system tremendously, and its impact on a person's life who is incarcerated will cast a shadow for years. I'll share one story with you of a young man I met named Kevin. And at the time I met him in hospital, he was recovering from a severe infection of his spine called osteomyelitis. It's an infection that you get when bacteria is introduced in the bloodstream, often because of injecting in unsafe conditions, or if you don't have access to harm reduction equipment like clean needles. This young man had been unhoused for years. He had a very severe opioid use disorder, and he had very little support. But we were lucky because his antibiotics worked, and he was able to be one of the people who didn't become disabled or have a life-threatening experience with this particular infection. And when he was released from hospital, we were able to find him a spot in an emergency shelter, and from there he was able to continue treatment that he had started in hospital for his opioid use disorder. Eventually, he was able to move from that shelter into a residential treatment program. He did extremely well in the residential treatment program, and after many months without using substances, he was able to eventually move into supportive housing. And when he had supportive housing, he didn't have to worry about his daily survival, so he was able to think about what he wanted to do with his life. And he decided that he wanted to enroll in school. He wanted to enroll in a program for social services because he wanted to be able to help people who might find themselves in similar circumstances to him. And he did incredible in school. He got straight A's and ended up on the honor roll, and our conversations became focused on what he was learning in school and what he hoped to do with his placements and what he hoped to contribute once he graduated. His mental health was stable, his physical health was stable, and he had safe, reliable housing, and everything seemed to be going in the right direction. Then came time for him to finish school and try to get a job in the social service sector, a career helping people like he intended. But he needed to complete a vulnerable sectors check. And with that vulnerable sectors check, a criminal record came up from the time years prior when he was deeply unwell, unhoused, had no support, and was just trying to survive while coping with a severe mental health disorder. And because of that record, he was unable to access the employment opportunities that he had been working to earn for years. He had done everything that we suggest people in similar circumstances do. He had accessed treatment. He had tried to build a new life. He had tried to find meaningful work and contribute to his community. He had done everything right, and yet his history of incarceration was holding him back at a critical turning point in his life. We can't be doing that to other people. And it certainly is not a strategy to address a public health crisis. And on the topic of addressing the opioid overdose crisis in Ontario, we know that the Auditor General recently concluded that the Ministry of Health does not have effective processes in place to meet the challenging and complex nature of the overdose crisis in Ontario. Amongst the Auditor General's findings, it concluded that the 2016 opioid strategy the ministry is working off of is outdated. It doesn't have the strategies we need to address the current crisis that we're in. And that makes sense because in 2016, we had barely started to see fentanyl on the street. Now it drives the vast majority of deaths that we see in our communities. We need a new strategy that reflects the complexity of the crisis we face today, and our government has failed to present one. The Auditor General also concluded that the government did not consider the impact of closing supervised consumption sites in our communities or on the people impacted by the overdose crisis. This doesn't surprise me, because anyone who actually worked in the field supporting people who use drugs or is a member of that community could tell you that closing supervised consumption sites in the height of a public health emergency is a bad idea.